March 30th, Charles Simeon.
Faith requires enduring the obstacles, not expecting them to disappear. Growing up, Charles Simeon was rich, shallow, and a fancy dresser. And when he first started college in Cambridge, he didn't really know the Lord. But when the bishop told him he was required to take the Lord's Supper, Simeon knew enough to know it was a serious thing to take Holy Communion without repenting. When Charles did turn to the Lord met him. The Lord Jesus saved Charles and changed his life. Now, with a new perspective, he desired to share the gospel at Cambridge. He finished his education and was certain God had called him to Cambridge. After a good word from his father to the bishop, Charles was hired as the new pastor at Cambridge, and he was ecstatic. But when he arrived at Trinity Church to start his new role, he found out the people of the congregation didn't want him. Not him, and certainly not his evangelical preaching. Mr. Hammond, a member of the clergy, was who they really wanted. He was familiar, popular, and had been in the church for a while. The people signed a petition saying that Hammond had already been hired as the pastor and sent it to the bishop. Charles felt heartbroken. Wasn't Trinity the place he was supposed to be? All he wanted to do was God's will, but God's will suddenly seemed cloudy. Distraught, he wrote a letter to the bishop and said he would not go against what the church wanted. But when he went to send the letter, he arrived at the post office too late to mail it. This gave him time to reflect, and he remembered his burning desire to preach the gospel at Cambridge. He knew God told him to go there. The parishioners even lied to the bishop and said Charles had agreed to leave. But the bishop wrote Charles and offered him the position again and said no matter what else happened, Mr. Hammond would not be the pastor. The next day, Charles preached his first sermon at the church. But still, the parishioners fought him. They went so far as to lock the pews to keep people from sitting. Some people stopped coming to church and tried to get others to stop too. They refused to let Charles visit or minister to them. They even locked the doors of the church so he couldn't establish a Sunday evening service. Charles tried to make peace and added chairs to the church at his own expense. He rented other rooms so he could minister to people there, but his congregation continued to fight. Charles turned desperately to God and prayed that the matter would be resolved. Charles preached only on Sunday mornings. During his services, disruptions happened, and people had to stand in the aisles to keep the peace. Other people threw stones at the windows. As for the chairs Charles had added, the church wardens threw them out of the church. Months of opposition became years, but eventually peace crept in, and as time wore on, the opposition wore out. After an entire decade, the congregation finally started to calm down, and within 12 years, Charles was able to fully preach at the church. He slowly gained a following. His steady, determined kindness prevailed. In the end, Charles served the people of Trinity Church for more than 50 years. The Bible tells us in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24, "And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful." Do you have a dream? How can belief and action work together to help you achieve it? Faith requires enduring the obstacles, not expecting them to disappear.
Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Carpenter. I'm the pastor of Southridge Church in Fairmont, West Virginia, and I'm one of the narrators for 365 Christian Men. Today is March 30th, and you just heard a story about Charles Simeon. You know, what stood out to me the most in today's story was Charles Simeon's fortitude in the face of opposition. As Charles humbly tried to follow Jesus, he experienced rejection and opposition for the better part of a decade. And I think sometimes we wrongly assume that following Jesus means that we won't face rejection and we won't face opposition. But it turns out that the opposite is true. You know, Jesus told his disciples in John 15:20, "A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." Following Jesus will always be met with opposition. But if you remain steadfast, like Charles Simeon, following Jesus will ultimately produce tremendous fruit. And so my challenge for you today is to reframe your thinking. Wherever you are experiencing opposition as a result of following Jesus, don't view that opposition as some insurmountable difficulty. View it instead as an opportunity to be like Jesus and to bear eternal fruit.